The GEA project was born out of the need for a new energy source. The Earth's surface could no longer sustain humanity's growing demands, and space exploration was still a distant dream for a planet on the brink of energy collapse. That's when the idea of the Prometheus Reactor emerged, a power plant capable of extracting energy directly from the Earth's core. The theoretical calculations were promising. If it were possible to drill deep into the planet and stabilize a highly efficient geothermal energy converter, we would have unlimited electricity for centuries. But the truth, as always, was far more complex. The robotic probes sent to explore the lower layers recorded inconsistent readings. Some were destroyed without explanation. Others simply disappeared. There was something down there, something the calculations hadn't predicted. But instead of retreating, the government and private investors decided to press on. If there was a secret buried in the heart of the planet, they would uncover it. Thus, the GEA mission was born, a direct dive into the Earth's depths aboard an experimental capsule. 5 specialists, each with a crucial role, were chosen for the descent: Dr. Elena Vasquez, geologist and expedition leader; Captain Marcus Steele Riggins, former soldier, responsible for security; Dr. Kian Nakamura, biologist specialized in extreme environments; Sophia Morales, systems engineer and drone operator; Dr. Viktor Volkov, creator of the Prometheus Reactor, nuclear physicist, and a man who knew more than he let on. The GEA capsule began its descent in the early hours of a Saturday. At first, everything went as expected. The upper layers were traversed without incident. The heat increased, the pressure became brutal, but the capsule's advanced technology held everything together. It was when they reached 4,800 kilometers deep that the readings began to go awry. Pressure stabilized, but we're getting strange readings, Elena murmured, furrowing her brow. Captain Marcus leaned over to look at the monitors. Strange how? Elena hesitated before answering. Metallic structures. And they're moving. The capsule wasn't supposed to encounter anything but magma and molten metal, but what the sensors showed wasn't natural. Gigantic crystalline columns rose from the ocean of liquid iron, arranged like pillars of a submerged city. They glowed with unknown symbols, pulsating in an almost living rhythm. This can't be natural. These formations seem planned, Kian murmured, both amazed and uneasy. This isn't geology. This is technology, he whispered. The silence that followed was heavy. It was Volkov who broke it, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. We continue. Our goal is to activate the reactor. These anomalies don't change that, but they did. They changed everything. The capsule moved forward, and then something hit them. A brutal seismic wave shook the vessel, throwing everyone against their seats. Alarms blared with red lights. That wasn't a normal tremor. Elena shouted. External impact. Something hit us. Sophia responded, struggling to regain control. And then the darkness moved. A colossal shadow emerged from the ocean of liquid iron. Its skin pulsed with a bluish bioluminescence, twisting into impossible shapes. Nothing should survive there. Nothing should exist there. But it did. My God, Kian whispered, both fascinated and terrified. The creature opened dozens of metallic eyes, which didn't just reflect light but knowledge. They observed. They assessed. And then, a voice echoed in their minds. You should not be here. Panic spread. Sophia tried to move the capsule, but the controls had locked. Elena tried to speak, but her mouth was dry. And Volkov smiled. He knew, Marcus growled, grabbing the scientist by the collar. You knew we'd find this here, didn't you? Volkov's smile widened. We need to move forward. The creature opened what seemed to be a mouth, and a pulsing wave of light engulfed the capsule. And then, everything turned white. They were no longer inside the Earth. They were somewhere else. The whiteness was absolute. There was no heat or cold, no sound or silence. Just a void stretching in all directions. Elena opened her eyes, but she wasn't sure if she had actually opened them. Her vision detected nothing, but somehow, she felt that something was there, watching. Then, as if a veil had been lifted, the world changed. The GEA capsule was no longer submerged in the ocean of liquid iron. They were in an immense, impossible space that defied all logic. The ground seemed to be made of liquid obsidian, reflecting images that didn't belong to this world. Above, a vault of lights pulsed in geometric patterns, forming constellations that spiraled in impossible ways. And in the center of it all, it waited for them. The creature they had seen in the magma now had a more defined form. Its body was elongated and slender, as if sculpted from space itself. Its face had no mouth or nose, only a set of gleaming eyes that seemed to absorb and distort the light around them. The voice returned, not in sound, but within their minds. "You have crossed the threshold. Now you will see what should not be seen." Elena felt her heart race. "Where are we? What is this place?" The entity tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing the question before responding. "You call it Earth. But this is not the Earth you know." Marcus held his weapon firmly, though he knew it was useless. Kian was paralyzed, his eyes wide with fascination and fear. Sophia fiddled with the capsule's systems, desperately trying to understand how they were still alive. It was then that Volkov laughed. "Magnificent. It's exactly as they said." Everyone turned to him. "What do you mean?" "As they said?" Marcus took a step forward. "You knew what we'd find?" Volkov finally looked at them, his eyes shining strangely. "Not exactly. But I knew there was something here. The government, the corporations, they always knew." "Knew what?" Elena pressed, anger overcoming fear. Volkov's smile was wrong. "That Earth is not natural." The silence that followed was crushing. The entity watched them, its form flickering like a reflection in water. The truth was buried, hidden under layers of time. Your species should never have dug so deep. Sophia frowned. "Hidden by whom?" The entity's eyes glowed. "By those who came before you." The atmosphere around them trembled, and the shadows began to move. The reflection in the black floor shifted, showing images of civilizations that were not human. Beings of various forms, some grand and magnificent, others distorted and monstrous, walked through impossible cities built within the planet's depths. "This is," Kian murmured, breathless. "This is a record?" Volkov approached the reflection, his eyes dancing over the images. "No. It's a memory." The scene changed. The underground cities burned. The ancient beings fled from something that should not exist. A vortex of black light opened in the center of one of the metropolises, consuming everything around it. And then, the entity spoke again. "They defied the laws of this world. They tried to control what should never have been touched. And they were destroyed for it." The vortex expanded, swallowing more cities, more civilizations. The last survivors sealed their knowledge beneath the Earth's crust, creating layers of protection so that no one else would find what they had unleashed. But humanity, in its quest for power, dug too deep. Marcus turned to Volkov. "You knew. You knew we were digging to release this." The physicist maintained his cold smile. "We're not releasing anything, Captain. We're taking up their legacy." Before anyone could react, an alarm sounded inside the capsule. Prometheus Reactor activation detected. Critical energy at 89%. Elena's eyes widened. "What? The reactor is activating on its own?" Volkov took a step back, his eyes shining with triumph. "The reactor wasn't designed just to generate energy. It's a catalyst." "A catalyst for what?" Kian shouted. The entity moved for the first time, its eyes narrowing. "You are breaking the seal." Volkov looked at the entity, and for the first time, spoke directly to it. "Exactly." The ground beneath them began to crack. Something was awakening. The capsule shook violently. "We have to get out of here!" Sophia screamed, activating the emergency systems. But before she could do anything, the white light engulfed them again, and then the world collapsed. The white light dissolved into darkness. An absolute, suffocating darkness, without form or direction. Time ceased to make sense. For a moment, or an eternity, they simply fell. Elena felt her body being pulled in all directions at once. Her chest burned, her mind spun, as if something was trying to tear her apart molecule by molecule. Then everything stopped. Her body hit a cold surface. Thin, dense air entered her lungs as she gasped, trying to understand where she was. The GEA capsule was no longer there. Around her, a black desert stretched as far as the eye could see. The ground wasn't earth or stone. It looked like melted glass, as if an ocean of obsidian had been frozen in time. Above, the sky wasn't a sky. The vastness was filled with swirling energy, pulsating nebulae that changed color and shape. Among them, colossal structures floated, resembling fragments of ancient cities. Elena heard a groan nearby. Sophia! She crawled over to the engineer, who was writhing in pain. Sophia was pale, her eyes wide as she looked at her own arm. Her skin was transforming. Blue veins glowed beneath her flesh, pulsing in strange patterns. I can't feel my right arm, Sophia murmured, terror evident in her voice. Elena held her hand tightly. Stay with me. We'll figure out what's happening. On the other side, Marcus was getting up, coughing. He still held his weapon, but his stance was no longer firm. He looked around, his eyes filled with disbelief. Where the hell are we? This can't be real, Kian murmured, trying to stand. His lab coat was torn, and there were cuts all over his face. His eyes trembled as he looked at the impossible horizon. Viktor Volkov was still standing. He looked at the horizon with a triumphant smile, as if he was exactly where he wanted to be. We've reached the core. The core? Elena shouted, unable to contain her fury. This isn't the Earth's core. This isn't even reality. Volkov slowly turned to her. What is reality, Dr. Vasquez? The question made Elena shiver. Something in his eyes. He knew more than he was saying. Before she could respond, the entity appeared again. It no longer floated in the ocean of liquid iron. Here, its presence was absolute. Its body seemed larger, more defined. Now, its contours resembled a humanoid, but its skin was still ethereal, fluid like a sea of shadows. Its eyes were suns, spinning in chaotic orbits within its skull. Its voice invaded their minds, echoing like distant thunder. You have crossed the boundary. Now, there is no turning back. Marcus raised his weapon. You brought us here? The entity didn't respond immediately. It simply raised one of its hands, a translucent, dripping hand made of pure energy. The ground trembled. In the distance, Elena saw something emerging from the black earth. At first, it seemed like a structure, a gigantic monolith. But then she realized it was a body. A colossal, humanoid but grotesque creature began to rise from the ground. Its skin was made of stone and molten metal. Its face had no eyes, nose, or mouth. Just an empty, cracked mass that pulsed with an inner light. And then, another creature emerged. Then another. Dozens, ancient beings dormant, were now awakening. No. This can't be, Kian stammered, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The entity looked at Volkov. You have freed them. Volkov spread his arms, like a prophet before his divine revelation. I brought them back. The earth began to scream. A deep, guttural sound that came from within space-time itself. The creatures moved, and hell began. The creatures advanced with hypnotic precision, as if they had emerged from a collective nightmare, distorted and devoid of any humanity. Their bodies, skeletal and imposing, were covered in a black, hot crust that seemed to move on its own, pulsating as if alive. The ground around them began to shake violently as they advanced, their feet resonating like hammer blows on fragile metal. Elena felt the ground split beneath her feet, and a wave of unbearable heat swept through the air. The creatures were closer now, their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowing with a bluish energy, as if they could see through flesh and soul. They knew they were there. Run! Marcus shouted, aiming his weapon at the nearest one. But what stood before them wasn't something that could be stopped by bullets. He knew that, but the instinct to survive made him try. The shots echoed, but the creature didn't even flinch. The impact seemed to be absorbed by its metallic skin, which simply regenerated every second. The burst of energy generated by firing the shots seemed more effective against themselves. The air around them ignited with waves of heat. There is no return for those who dare disrupt the balance. The entity's voice echoed in their minds again, cold and impersonal. The echo of those words seemed to pierce their bones. Elena tried to process what was happening, but her mind couldn't handle the magnitude of it. They were approaching rapidly, moving with supernatural speed. The atmosphere was saturated with a dense, heavy energy, as if the air itself was trying to crush them. "Stay together!" Elena shouted, panic now taking hold of her chest, but she tried to maintain composure. What little rationality remained was slipping away, replaced by the feeling that they were inside a nightmare they couldn't escape. Kian, who was beside her, seemed in a trance, watching the creatures approach, as if something deep in his mind was trying to comprehend the impossible before him. He took a hesitant step back, but was pulled by Victor. "We need to go!" The physicist was almost desperate, with an expression of someone who already knew what was about to happen. But his words no longer carried weight. He knew there was no escape from that place. The monsters began to move faster, the first ones already within a few meters of them. The air seemed to compress around the capsule, as if space-time itself was being torn apart. Then, without further warning, the creatures lunged. It was an explosion of pure force. The creatures moved like a tide of steel, and before they could react, one of them grabbed Sophia, dragging her with unimaginable strength. Her scream echoed, cutting through the tension, but was quickly silenced as she was dragged into the abyss of the monolith. Her body crushed against the ground. "Sophia!" Elena shouted, but there was nothing more to be done. The engineer was swallowed by the shadows of one of the creatures. Panic took hold of everyone, but there was no more time for lamentations. The ground was shattering as the creatures advanced. They weren't just physically imposing, they seemed to manipulate reality around them, distorting space as they moved. Fear spread quickly. Elena, Marcus, Kian, and Victor ran without direction. The terrain changed with every step they took, as if the very geometry of that place was being altered by something greater. The creatures seemed to follow a pattern, as if chaos was a controlled force, guiding their actions in perfect harmony with the winds of the abyss. "We have already judged you," the entity said, its words flowing like a shockwave through everyone's minds. "This is the end of your journey. You are the flaw that crossed the veil." The corridors of stone, or whatever those structures were, began to close around them. The walls compressed, leaving them with no way out. The creatures were everywhere, their eyes lighting up with every movement of the humans. It was then that Victor stopped running. He looked at the figure that appeared before him, a creature even larger than the previous ones. Its wings, if they could be called that, beat the air with a deafening roar, creating a vortex of energy around them. "Victor! What did you do?" Elena shouted, but he only smiled. "I did nothing." His voice sounded almost proud, as if he had fulfilled a greater mission. Before anyone could react, the monolith of stones in the background exploded in a burst of light that almost blinded the four. A wave of heat enveloped them, and the creatures shot toward the center of the energy, disappearing into what seemed to be a dimensional portal. What remained for Elena and the others was emptiness. But amidst it, the sound of something approaching, something even older, even more powerful. The explosion of light emanating from the monolith seemed to cut through space itself, distorting everything around them. The ground shattered and cracked like glass, and the sound of stones breaking reverberated through the void. Elena could barely see, the blinding brightness overwhelming her senses, and she felt the heat burning her skin, as if reality itself was disintegrating. But when the light dissipated, reality didn't return to what it was before. There was something different. A deep abyss, vaster than anything they had ever seen, opened before them. A vastness without end, an abyss of pure darkness and pain, and it was in this void that their true presence made itself known. A snapping sound filled the air, and in the same instant, one of the larger creatures, of impossible proportions, emerged from the shadows. It was immense, covered in black, shimmering scales that moved as if alive. Its eyes, or what remained of them, burned like embers, and its mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth as sharp as obsidian blades, ready to tear apart anything. Marcus was the first to succumb. When he tried to take a step back, his legs failed. It was as if the weight of terror was physically crushing him. He looked at the monolith to his left, searching for a possible escape route, but before he could react, the enormous creature lunged at him with supernatural speed. It dug its claws into Marcus's back, tearing through his flesh like paper. The sound of bones breaking was muffled by Marcus's agonizing scream, but he had no time for anything else. The creature's claws tore through his torso, ripping chunks of flesh with each movement, until nothing remained but a pile of broken bones and shredded meat. Blood gushed in all directions, covering the ground and walls, while Marcus's entrails spread in a visceral explosion. The creature didn't stop there. Its eyes glowed with grotesque pleasure as it devoured Marcus's still warm flesh, chewing with insatiable fury. Every piece it tore off was a silenced scream, an explosion of pain unrecognizable to any human. Elena was paralyzed, but her mind was alert, trying to understand how they could escape this nightmare. Kian, still dazed, could barely believe what he was seeing. He was immobile, frozen by terror, watching what remained of Marcus being consumed by the creature. It was then that another figure appeared, emerging from the shadows. A shorter creature, but just as monstrous as the first. With disconcerting speed, it leaped onto Kian, tearing off his head with a single swipe of its sharp claws. The sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking was like thunder amidst the chaos. Kian's body fell to the ground with a thud, his eyes still open, an expression of pain immortalized on his face. His neck gushed a fountain of blood, and the remains of his head fell beside his body, the blood mixing with that of the others. Kian's last breath was muffled by the sound of metal breaking and flesh being shredded by the creature. Elena couldn't look away from what remained of him. Her mind was in a state of denial, but reality forced her to see the horror. There was no more Kian. There was nothing human left there, only absolute destruction. Victor was in a panic, his brain trying to process the scene before him, but he was no longer in control. His voice trembled as he spoke, desperate. "No. There's no way out," he shouted, but his eyes were glazed, focused on the creature in front of him. He already knew, deep down, that there was no salvation. The creature advanced toward Victor, its sharp claws gleaming in the dim light. Victor tried to react, but the monster's strength was overwhelming. It grabbed him by the shoulders, tearing through his skin with ease. Before Victor could scream, the claws dug deeper, disintegrating his flesh. Blood gushed, covering everything around, as Victor was mercilessly torn apart. His screams were muffled, and his flesh became unrecognizable, mixing with the entrails and blood that covered the ground. The bones in his arms cracked under the creature's weight, and when it finally released him, nothing remained but a mutilated body, the pieces scattered across the ground like grotesque puzzle pieces. Elena was now alone, surrounded by all those abominations. But she didn't dare close her eyes, knowing that death awaited her every second. She felt the heat coming from the creatures, a crushing pressure in her chest. There was nowhere to run. The abyss had closed around her, the way back no longer existed. She was in a prison of pain and despair, and then, the entity spoke once more, its voice echoing like thunder in her mind. "All of you are flaws, mere insects who dared to challenge the order of the abyss. Now, the end will come as relentlessly as your sin." With a roar of primal force, the creatures advanced. Elena knew it was the end. And before she could take another step, the claws of darkness enveloped her, tearing her apart from within and without, ripping her flesh, shredding her as if she were just another piece of meat to be devoured. The abyss wasn't just the end of the world. It was the end of everything. And hell would never forget those who descended into it. Elena, now being consumed by the darkness, no longer felt pain. Her body was torn apart, and crushed with such brutality that the sensations were diluted in the depths of death itself. The last thing she saw was the creatures, their distorted and menacing forms, advancing on her, macabre shadows, before the void swallowed her completely. The abyss was silent now. But the silence was only the pause before the chaos. Something moved in the depths of the earth, something older and more terrible than anything they had faced before. The air was dense and heavy, as if space itself was vibrating with primal energy, and it was at that moment that the final presence manifested. Slowly, a gigantic shadow emerged, more immense than anything anyone could conceive, a colossal figure that seemed to devour reality itself around it. Its forms were indistinct, but there was something humanoid in its outline, something that didn't belong to that place, but was there now, in a terrible and absurd form. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were like slits of a bottomless abyss, and its mouth seemed like an open wound in the very fabric of existence. The creature began to move, its heavy, bloodied feet breaking the stones as if they were paper, causing the ground to crack and split. Death was closer now. And it was inevitable. The entity spoke again, its voice a deep, echoing sound, vibrating in the depths of all hearts. You dared to challenge the guardians of the abyss. Now you will be consumed by eternity. The last vestige of humanity that remained in the hearts of Victor and the others faded with those words. They had faced horrors that defied all logic, and the terror in their minds could no longer be contained. They knew what was coming, complete extinction. When the giant shadow advanced, it struck the ground with crushing force, sending a shockwave that shattered the stones around it like mere shards. A storm of destruction began, the ground crumbling, and the earth itself seemed to disintegrate under the touch of its claws. Victor, whose body was now torn apart by the creature's fury, had his head crushed under the force of a violent blow, exploding in a burst of blood and bone fragments. The sound of the skull shattering was muffled by the roar of the abyss. The creature, insatiable, consumed what remained of him, absorbing his still warm flesh in an act as grotesque as it was animalistic. There was no more dignity in death, only emptiness and darkness. The terrain, now engulfed in irreversible destruction, no longer offered shelter. Reality was fragmenting, distorting into bizarre and unrecognizable forms. Elena, whose body had been crushed until nothing remained but a tangle of flesh and broken bones, now disappeared into a growing mist of darkness. The abyss was reforming, and those who had challenged its nature were now becoming part of it. But there was something more. Something emerging from the depths of the abyss. The entity that ruled it all, which had made its presence known to each of those who fell into that place, watched with inscrutable eyes. And suddenly, the entire earth opened up, like a wound that would never heal. The air was swallowed by darkness, and a wave of heat enveloped them, melting everything around them, fusing flesh, metal, and stone into a single substance of destruction and pain. With one final roar, the abyss swallowed them all, and with them, any trace of human resistance. They were nothing more than echoes in the void, shadows in the depths that would never be heard again.